Hello there, and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another costuming project. Now, so far I have stayed safely in the third bustle period, sort of a mid-1880s shape for both the cicada gown here on the channel and also the carmine gown that I made recently this year. But it's finally time to stray away from my giant bustle and go for something a little bit more tame and completely different, like the 1890s. So, you know, just a handful of years later. Truly, the ideas for this gown began last year when I was making the cicada gown because I was looking at all the different colors of green silk that Silk Baron offer. A dangerous prospect indeed, and I did spot this color of silk that I'll be using for this project back then, over a year ago, and thought, wow, wouldn't that make something like Darkly Delicious? And I was thinking about the big sleeves from Crimson Peak because I was already looking at Crimson Peak as inspiration for that dress, even though it was the wrong time period, but just that sort of Crimson Peak vibe of that dark gothic, like modern sensibilities plus historic silhouettes and yet insect inspiration and like spooky inspiration, all being mixed up in a Guillermo del Toro blender. And I was really enjoying that vibe, and I was looking at this fabric at the time too and thought, man, wouldn't that make a great 1890s dress? So since I got a few swatches with my silk order, I went ahead and ordered a swatch of this Mandragora silk from Silk Baron. This is a ribbed, like a fine ribbed textured silk taffeta from Silk Baron. It's actually black threads mixed with yellow and like a mauvey brown color. So there's no actually green threads that make up this color in the end. It's all an illusion created by your eye when you look at this mix of colors woven together. So it's rather an iridescent color of taffeta to begin with, and then of course I shine my fun colored lights on it because, as we can tell, I love me some LEDs. So really I am going for a kind of forest floor, what's underneath the crunchy leaves, if you turn over a log, and yet it was glamorous kind of a vibe. And today, as an introduction to this costume, I wanted to go over my inspirations in full, show you the sketch I've come up with for this design, talk about the patterns I'll be using for this, and then of course I will be making the skirt for this costume today as well. And yes, this is going to be more directly inspired by the world of Crimson Peak perhaps than my last costume. It's not really a cosplay, it's not a copy of any of the gowns. In the movie though, I would like one of each, if anyone out there in the universe is offering, especially that gold Nancy Drew dress, as they call it. But of course the design of this film is just absolutely delicious, and I do want to incorporate some moth designs into this eventually as well. You'll see later in my sketch that I have mostly spider webs dripping around this gown, but I do want to have some moths that have landed in or on that web in the end as well. Which of course meant that I had to scour the internet to find out which species of moth are living in the attic of the Crimson Peak house. And it turns out if you zoom in on the art book, I found a video of someone flipping through the art book, which is rather expensive, otherwise I would have just bought a copy. But on the page about Lucille's room, they mention that they are emperor moths, which are native to parts of Europe, including the UK. So this is a moth that could have lived in the Crimson Peak house as well. And it happens to be absolutely gorgeous, as most moths are, honestly. But of course, I'm not going to get to the accessories and like embellishments yet because we have to make the gown before we can embellish it. Let's go ahead and dive into some inspiration images and I'll show you what I've got in mind. And no, I don't want to wear my bangs to the side like this, but I need a haircut. So here we are. And so let us begin by looking at the 1890s silhouette in general, the general shapes that we have for this decade. These are some images from the mid-1890s showing the larger exaggerated shoulder and sleeve situation they had going on, and the more A-line shaped skirts that were coming into prominence at this time. Of course, the bustle from the 1880s had faded away. We do still have some hip padding and small bustling in the back, but nothing like the previous bustle eras before it. Much more edging into the Edwardian look that will come in the decade after this. Now, as far as direct inspiration from Crimson Peak in any of those costumes, I did see this little tail on this jacket that Edith wears, and I quite like this little ribbony peplum on the back of this bodice, and I did see the same detail on this red Worth dress, and also this other bodice from a different museum had this kind of bat wing-like shaped skirt on the back of the bodice, and I thought that was a fun addition that I could include. And of course, the idea of kind of fusing a Gothic aesthetic with this time period is not a stretch, because if we look at some examples of just bodices and gowns from this era, and I have a bunch more on my Pinterest, these are just a few examples of kind of black and jewel tones combined together, natural motifs, of course, coming in. This is a little bit early Art Nouveau here. And black embellishments are common for both regular kind of gowns and then, of course, all the morning wear. Nothing in this collage here I don't think is morning wear properly. The purple stuff might be half morning, but it's not hard to find examples of more Gothic-leaning items from this time period, and it certainly doesn't seem a stretch to lean in that direction for a modern gown inspired by this period. I did see this fashion plate here while looking through the Met's fashion plate galleries. I will link that below. And I think this here actually is not two bodices in one skirt, but it's actually a set of sleeves and a collar that get worn with the bodice and skirt and then get removed for evening. But this page from 1894 here still shows that often a gown would be ordered with multiple bodices in one skirt, just because, of course, the amount of silk to make an ensemble like this would have been quite costly, and so it made financial sense to be able to rewear your skirts as much as possible. And so to have two bodices, three bodices, have a way to transform your gowns from dinner to evening or from day to evening made a lot of sense economically, and therefore was still something that was being done in the 1890s as well. And of course I will eventually be making an evening bodice for this Mandragora gown as well. And both that fashion plate and these show the general shape of skirt that I will be using for this Mandragora gown as well. You can see here along the front of this, the front of the skirt is made into an A-line shape with a long, almost princess seam down either side of the center. So there's like a center panel here in an A-line shape, and then the rest of the skirt, any gathering or fullness of the skirt is really concentrated in just the center of the back of the skirt. And also the image on the right here shows that those seams are covered with a line of ruffles that then go around the back of the skirt, and I just thought that was a fun detail. I'd never seen that before until I saw this fashion plate. It seemed like a fun idea, especially if you had a fabric that really wanted to pucker or that seam wasn't laying flat. This would be a good way to save that sort of thing. So I just thought I'd include this fashion plate because I was particularly interested by that. Of course, we do still have the stand collars. They're a little bit taller even here than they were in the 1880s, although in the 1880s they did get this tall as well, but it seems to be even more common here in the 1890s. And then we do have the new edition of puff sleeves, well, leg of mutton sleeves, getting larger and larger towards in the middle of this 1890s period. And again, I have been looking through a lot of extant garments and photographs and fashion plates like this, so you can find more inspiration images linked into my Pinterest board below. Now for this costume, once again, I will be using truly Victorian patterns. I have TV 493, a bodice pattern. I think it's called like the basic 1890s bodice pattern or something like that. And then TV 292 for my skirt pattern. This skirt pattern looks really similar to those images we were just looking at. To me, it looks nearly identical. The train on the TV pattern is a little bit longer. It does come in two lengths, but I will be making mine with the full train so that I can wear it for both afternoon thing, as an afternoon dress, as a day dress, and then also with the evening bodice later and have it still look appropriate with a little bit of a train going on. I do imagine that I will have to make quite a few changes to that bodice pattern to achieve something more like this. Here's my sketch for this gown. I didn't really sketch the full skirt because it is just going to be that simple skirt. It's rather a simple shape, but of course the textile itself will be quite magnificent and make up for the simplicity. But here's my sketch for the Mandragora gown bodice, the day bodice here. Of course we have our giant sleeves with the fitted lower section, and then a central section of the bodice I want to have gathered sheer organza or chiffon, some lace, maybe even I have some lace in my stash so we can look at that, over either the same olive green silk or maybe even yellow silk I have in my stash. I'll have to see because I think either would work, and I'm going to play around with a little bit with that once I get to the bodice. And then all the spider webs you see here I want to do in black glass beads to look like jet beading. So you can see I have these glass beads here that I've ordered from a Etsy bead seller that I quite like called General Bead. I will link them in the description below. But today, before I begin beading, I will be starting off with the skirt. And here are the three pieces of the truly Victorian pattern all cut out, laid out on the basement floor, ready for my fabric. And here is my fabric. I did end up taping that back the two pieces of the skirt back, I suppose, together along the seam line. I just figured I didn't need to have a seam there, so I didn't want to. And I'm going to cut out this central front A-line piece on the fold here. And then I'm just keeping the grain line consistent between, along that seam line for the front of the skirt, or the side of the skirt, I suppose. So I'm cutting mine out in three big pieces, that front one on the fold, and then this back piece I'm cutting out two. And of course I will need to go over here onto the ironing board and press all of that. And then I'm going to layer each piece over a, like its twin, only cut out in cotton muslin. So here I am pinning the center front piece of this skirt onto a muslin piece that is the same. Of course, because of course, just like the cicada gown and like the carmine gown, I'm going to interline all of my skirt pieces here. Luckily, there's only 3 of them, but the back piece is quite large and unwieldy. This front one, no problem, but it's kind of annoying to do all this same stuff for the back piece. I did switch back over to my beading needles for doing this basting. I'm using a cotton Gutermann thread here that I ran through some beeswax, just so that it will behave and not get too tangled on me. But I do prefer using beading needles for basting silk and muslin together, and so that is what I am doing here. So you can see the back of this is now black because it's covered in muslin. And then while I have this flat here on top of the blue patterning table of doom, let's grab a little bit more thread, and I will go ahead and like whip stitch around the raw edges, or bind the raw edges together with a large line of whip stitching, just so that none of this frays. You could of course bind this in rayon or silk binding. You could do French seams, which you'll never see me do because I just don't like them. You could cut this with pinking shears. Many different options here. This is a technique that was used in the period and it works well for me, so I'm just doing that. And then of course I have to do the back pieces the same way and prep those the same way. And then I can move them back up here onto the blue patterning table of doom and mark the 2 darts we have for this project. On each of the back pieces we have one of these darts. This dart isn't in the front of the garment, it aligns with the side. So this is like where a side seam would normally be on an A-line skirt. Instead of having a side seam, it just has this little dart at the top to shape it to the hips. So this is going to go over the side of my hips here, this little dart. And I was, kind of just praying that it worked at this point because, I hadn't made a mock-up of this skirt. Risky business. But I just trusted Truly Victorian to not let me down, because they haven't yet. But maybe a day will come. But it is not this day, thank goodness. But here I am basting this 2 layers of this skirt piece together before I sew the dart as well. This just helps everything stay together and not move around too much on you when you're trying to sew these darts. Luckily, again, compared to some of my modern projects, and I say modern, but I mean vintage, this has very few darts, just these 2. So I'll go ahead and pin these. Make sure everything is good, double checking quite a lot here. Make sure everything I've pinned in the right, everything pinned in the right spot. And then I can go ahead and sew this dart over here on the machine. Again, this Singer 99K from the 50s is not that different from a machine that would have been used in the 1890s. It just has an electric motor, and I'm pretty sure that if they had access to one with an electric motor in the 1890s, they would have been all about it. Although I don't think Bakelite had been invented yet for the foot pedal. And I don't like the idea of celluloid and machinery together because that stuff's pretty flammable, so perhaps it's for the best. But I will go ahead and just tie off the end of that dart like I tend to do for all of my darts. No different here, even though I'm working on costuming instead of clothing. And then I will just go ahead and press those finished darts over my tailor's ham here, just from both the inside and the outside to get those nice and smooth. Again, those are going to rest over my hips, so it's going to be over a curve, so it's nice to iron it on a curve as well. And then I can go ahead and line up the front princess seam, for lack of a better, pretty much that's what it is, princess seam of the skirt. A princess of the, under the log forest times, hopefully, like I was saying earlier. But I have those front seams all pinned together with my silk pins here. I'm taking my time to make sure nothing's bubbling or doing anything strange, and I will just sew both of those front seams on each side. This isn't a very hard skirt to construct. The difficulty in this is, of course, working with silk and being careful and not snagging anything, but also just maneuvering large pieces of fabric around in the sewing room, because it is a bit I don't know, I guess for people who like quilting and stuff like that, it seems very easy, but to me, I don't usually work on garments this large, so this is just a lot of fabric to move around, and it can be quite heavy, especially 2 layers like this once you have the muslin interlining, so it is more of a workout, not because a great deal of puzzling together skill is required. I mean, we're only sewing 3 pieces together here and then putting a waistband on. It's not that difficult, but maneuvering around with this much fabric is kind of irritating. People who make quilts and curtains, you must have some upper body strength that I do not have. But of course, once I have those seams sewn together, I'm going to go ahead and iron, press them open, and then I can sew the center backs together, which you leave about, I think they recommend 7 inches at the top open to fold back for having an opening of a placket so you can put the skirt on. I left about 8 inches there, I think, and still I think I should have left another inch, honestly, to get this on and off. But it'll be all right in the end. I end up adding a placket to this, which is not something that the Truly Victorian includes, but I'll show you what I mean in a minute. They just have you fold back either side of that center back seam like this, and then I'm just felling down that seam allowance so that it stays smooth and nice. And this is how Truly Victorian have you plan to do it, I think. But then I added a placket in back here just because the skirt did come out a tiny bit small. I did go ahead and use some lightweight interfacing on the waistband piece. Again, fusible interfacing, not very accurate, but I didn't want to have to interline this, so here we are, just using some interfacing so it doesn't stretch out too much on me. And then on one side of this, I will go ahead and fold it underneath a 1/2 inch and press that into place so that it's easier for me to fold my waistband together later. But on the smooth side, I'm going to start pinning the skirt to the waist. Now, this is easy enough for the center portion of the skirt, but of course for the back portion of the skirt, Truly Victorian just says, pleat or gather the skirt down to size. And they don't give you any instructions on how to pleat it. But I looked at a lot of gowns from this period. I think this one on the right definitely is a Worth gown, but I can't remember where the other one is from. But they both seem to have pleats like facing towards the inside of the back, like towards the center back, as opposed to outwards. So that is how I pleated mine down. I just added, I think it's 3 pleats on each side. And unfortunately, I didn't get the best footage of doing that. Unfortunately, I was having some trouble. As I started editing this, I was like, what was I doing with my camera angles this day? But you try and concentrate it really close to the center back as much as possible. Keep the rest of it very smooth, because the gathering on these skirts really is, or like the fullness of these skirts really is concentrated to like the center, like 4 inches of the center back. But here I am sewing the waistband onto the skirt, or the skirt onto the waistband rather. And of course that green light is making this fabric glow the most delicious color of all time, although the silk just in general is literally divine. And if I had a house, I would be like, you know, going into debt to buy enough of this to make bed curtains and regular curtains and upholstered chairs or whatever, because it's just so pretty. Oh, my dream color. I mean, the cicada gown is also a gorgeous emerald color. I'm just going to have each room in my house going to be a different shade of green. We should all know by now that I love green. But here I am folding that other side of the waistband into the interior of this skirt and pinning it down, finishing off the ends, and I will just fell all this down on the inside. I'm actually just using some black silk thread to do this, just because I already had some sitting here at my desk. And the best thread to use is the one that's already next to you, so you don't have to stand up again and move around. So here I am felling that down. And then I end up, again, adding a little bit of a placket. So I just took, I think it's like a 4-inch wide piece of, maybe it's only 3 inches wide, probably 3 inches wide, piece of spare silk here. And I'm just sewing that into a little rectangle, like a little pillow that I'm not going to stuff, you know. This is the simplest part. If you've made a pillow, you can make a placket. But I'm just going to finish that off and then position this in place. I could have made this a little bit longer. As you can see, it's a little bit short. But I'm just attaching this to one side of the placket. I'm, of course, again, a lot of times when you see me doing things, I'm only felling it down to the inner lining, not the outside, so no stitches show on the outside. That's the best thing about inner lining, is that you can stitch all kinds of things down to the inside without it showing on the outside. It's like magic. But here I am just felling that placket down, again, to the inside. No stitches are going to show on the outside for this. And it doesn't really matter if your placket's on the right or the left. Like, whatever. You're probably dressing yourself, so your imaginary lady's maid doesn't care either way, I suppose. And you could add snaps or hooks all the way down along this placket. This really I'm just putting here just in case the skirt shifts a little bit in the back when I'm wearing, like, say, the evening bodice, because with the day bodice, I'm hoping to have like a little skirt pep up in the back of the bodice anyhow, so none of this would show anyhow. But in case the evening bodice, in case it's seen while I'm wearing the evening bodice in the future, I just wanted this to be nice and finished in the back. You can see how this lays here on the right side. Of course, some of my basting threads were showing through, my white cotton basting threads, so I was like, dang it. And I'm just removing those anywhere they possibly show, and I just remove the basting along the top part of this placket E area, just so that none of my white stitching shows. Of course, you could baste in a color that matches, but then that's not good for camera. And of course, I'm sewing for myself, but also for you. And then I'm just going to sew a skirt hook on up here. I think the more accurate choice would be to use hook and eyes, but I quite like skirt hooks. They're very flat and they feel quite secure to me. So I'm going to secure one of these on up here. I was thinking about adding a second one beneath this, but it's just really not that necessary. Again, if I were making this because I gave tours of a historic home and was going to be wearing it every day, I would make something a little bit hardier, but alas, I won't be able to wear this all the time and therefore don't need it to be too hardy. Now all that's left to do is to hem this skirt. I have a 3-inch wide bit of cotton voile here, strips of bias cut on the 45-degree angle at 3 inches wide, and I'm going to sew those strips together to create one long piece of bias I can use. And again, just like I did with the waistband, I'm folding down one side of that a 1/2 inch so that my job is easier later. And I'll sew the non-ironed side down to the top of the skirt. This is right sides together, the outside of the skirt, and this will all be folded to the inside in a moment. This is not how the Truly Victorian pattern suggests you hem this. I mean, there's no problem with bias hemming, it's perfectly accurate. But they do recommend having a stiffening like along the bottom 6 inches or so of the skirt, and I see that done quite often, even in recreations. A lot of people will put in tarlatan or cotton organdy at least, or even organza down here. If I had a ton of silk organza around, I would have put silk organza in the bottom 10 inches of the skirt, but I just don't have very much silk organza in stock, and it is kind of expensive. So I'm just going to hem this with this voile. So it doesn't have a lot of stiffener in the skirt here. I would rather have the skirt be a little bit limp than have the stiffener, the line of stiffener show. Sometimes when you see a skirt, you can see 6 inches above the hem where that stiffener starts. You can see that line. I would rather have a slightly limp skirt than be able to see a line of the stiffener in there. So that's kind of the choice I made here. I could always go back in here and add a stiffener to the hem if I somehow acquire more organza. But for now, I'm just going to leave it like this, and here I am, hand stitching down. I'm just felling this down on the inside to the inner lining again. So again, these stitches will not show on the outside, but stitching that bias down. This is how I hem most curved hems in life. Most skirts you see me do on the channel, I use bias to hem them. That is not a stitch there, by the way. That is a flaw in the fabric. I promise no stitches will show on the outside, but I'm just going to go around here and fell all of this down, and then my Mandragora skirt will be finished for now. I may end up making a new petticoat to go with this because I'm not super thrilled with how my 1880s petticoat looks with this. I feel like it works, but something that is more in line with the shape of this and has a little bit of fluff for the train to help hold out the train a little bit more might work better. So I may end up making a new petticoat for this sometime along the way here. Here is the finished 1890s skirt for this Mandragora gown. I am thrilled with how it came out. I was a little, concerned just because I'd never tried this shape before. I didn't make a mock-up for this, so I was, wasting potentially a lot of silk if this didn't work out. I figured, anything that happened could be salvageable, especially because I want to have a little bit of a back peplum on the bodice anyway, so anything that happened at the top of the skirt waist, I could probably fudge a little bit. I do think this came out just a tiny bit small for me through the hips, this skirt. I probably could have gone up at least one size in the Truly Victorian pattern, but I've been having trouble with my Victorian skirts coming out a tiny bit too big, so I was just sticking with the same size, hoping that that would be the case, but then this time it was just a tiny bit too small, so I probably should have sized up in this. If I make this skirt again, I'll probably go up to the next size and just add a 1/4 inch along the side seams of the front perhaps, but I still think it works quite well, and as long as I, kind of don't... the more I stand up straight, the better it looks, so honestly it's just a posture problem more than anything. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to this Mandragora gown project. I know I'm very excited to jump into the bodices here soon. I'm super thrilled about seeing how big these sleeves are and if I can make them bigger perhaps. Who knows? I don't exactly know what I'm going to use for the interior structure for those. We'll have to see how well they hold themselves up on their own in taffeta. I don't know, I was kind of thinking about interlining them with organza. We'll see how it goes next time when I start working on the bodice. Thank you as always for watching this video today, and a special thank you to all of my patrons who of course make projects like this possible. I could never do a big huge art project, have this much silk in stock here in the studio without your support and your help, so thank you so much for making my work possible. And I better go get started on that bodice because of course I need to mock it up, make it, and then embellish the whole thing, and I don't have a lot of time planned out to do all of that, so we'll see how I do. I'll update you here real soon, and I'll see you then. Bye.